Hey, what's up, guys? So I'm going to explain flip-flops and latches, how they work. So the key concept here is explained. The difference between a flip-flop and a latch is the point at which the clock causes the state to actually change. So here we have a clocked latch. This is our clocked latch. C represents clock input, D represents input, and here we have the operation of a D latch. So if we read here, it says, if we continue reading, it says, in a clocked latch, the state is changed. So this output here represents, the Q output represents the state being changed. So it says the state is changed whenever the appropriate inputs change. So if we look, instead of focusing on this diagram, let's look here. So we see that our input D is initially low and then it becomes high. So that means that the input has changed. Now let's continue following. It says the state is changed whenever the appropriate inputs change and the clock is asserted. What that means when it says clock is asserted is that means the clock is high. So if we look here, we see clock is initially low, and as it goes high, that means that the clock has been asserted. So now that we know two things, one, our input has changed and the clock has been asserted, the statement here, the idea here is that the state is going to change. And if we compare that statement to our diagram, we see that is actually true. We see that our input has changed and the clock has been asserted, so therefore we see here that the state has changed. Initially the state was low and then it becomes high, and the only reason that the state has changed again is because our input has changed as well as the clock has been asserted. So when you have those two conditions, we see that the state has changed. Now if we keep on reading, since this statement, this idea is supposed to represent the difference between a flip-flop and a latch, we'll go ahead and look next at a flip-flop, since this two diagrams represent a latch. So it says, if we continue where we left off, it says in a flip-flop, the state is changed only on a clock edge. So before I go to the diagram of a flip-flop, I just want to say that an edge for a clock represents this line here, this line here, this line here, and this line here. And there's two different ones. So this, whenever we're going right and we go up, right, assuming that clock moves from left to right, this here represents a rising edge, which means that the clock goes from low to high, and this edge represents a falling edge, which means the clock goes from high to low. So let's go ahead and go to that diagram of a flip-flop. So here's our flip-flop. Notice that we also have D input and we also have clock input. But let's not focus too much on this. Let's look here to see how the state is changed, because the state is ultimately what represents what is happening when you have input and you have clock. And it helps us understand the difference between a flip-flop and a latch. So as we were reading, it says, in a flip-flop, the state is changed only on the clock edge. So using the knowledge that we gained from the previous idea of a state being changed, we can recall that this is our state here, and we see it changing. We see Q, we see that it's initially low, and then it becomes high. So that means that the state has changed. So now, in a flip-flop, the key difference to a state being changed is dependent upon the clock edge. And as I showed before, here are the clock edges. This is a rising edge, this is a falling edge. We see in this example that we have a flip-flop with a falling edge trigger. So what that means is whenever the clock has a falling edge, that moment is when the state changes. And that is really important. That is the biggest difference between a D flip-flop and a latch. The biggest difference is that with the flip-flop, state is changed depending on the clock edge. So we can see that here. we see initially the clock input has a rising edge, which doesn't affect the state at this point, but when we have a falling edge, we see that we have a state change. State goes from low to high. Now if we continue on in the clock diagram, we see it has a rising edge and it's high, means clock is asserted. And then once we have a falling edge, we see boom, state has changed again. State this whole time was high. All of a sudden now it becomes low. And again, state is changed due to the edge of the clock. In this case, the falling edge is what triggers a state change. That is all. Thank you.